Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for giving me this opportunity, though I'm not able to present on the screen. Now, as many of you already know, Africa is one of the most vulnerable continents to climate change and climate variability. Africa and its citizens are already suffering and will continue to suffer some of the most devastating consequences of climate change. But too often, Africa is very absent from the national and international climate debate. But somebody might ask, why Africa talks climate? Well, in the run-up to Copenhagen in Finland, the international community has been increasingly engaged in communicating to the Western public and key policymakers the impacts of climate change in Africa and the rest of the developing world. Yet the intensive media coverage and public awareness campaigns prevalent in much of the industrialized world have been largely absent in Africa, particularly outside major urban centers. In Africa, ladies and gentlemen, despite growing governmental and civil society engagement, information about climate change, let alone their effects to the international debate on it, is still only the purview of the very few. And since now little has been known about how climate change is currently perceived and understood by Africans. Africa Talks Climate was designed to address this. And I will take now a few minutes to let you through some of the main findings of the insights that this research generated. Now, ladies and gentlemen, with little known about how Africans understand climate change, a qualitative research design was adopted to enable us to explore in depth the public understanding of climate change across various countries and sectors of African society. Focus group discussions were convened with over 1,000 citizens from the DR Congo, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, Sudan, Tanzania, and Uganda. And interviews carried out with nearly 200 policymakers, religious leaders, business people, journalists, and civil society representatives. The research gathered the views of farmers and fishermen, pastoralists and business people, women and men, rich and poor, rural and urban. Its main aim was to assess public understanding of climate change and identify how communication and the media could best support Africans' response to climate change. Discussions were carried out in a total 25 languages and transcribed, coded and analyzed by an international team of researchers. Despite our experience on communicating in the developing world, we recognize that we were not experts on climate change and did not want to pretend to be. Therefore, prior to fieldwork, we consulted and met with experts in each country to understand climate change's current and projected impacts there. They helped us select fieldwork locations that sought to capture the key environmental and climate-related challenges facing each country, and crucially, they provided us with feedback and support throughout the analysis and reporting stage. Now to some of the key findings. Ladies and gentlemen, Africans are experiencing environmental and climatic changes. Although it may come as a little surprise, across all the Africa Talks Climate countries, people believe the weather and the environment is changing. People report less predictable seasons, particularly the loss of distinct rainy seasons, increases in temperature, and more frequent and intense droughts and floods. They say these changes are already affecting their lives and in many cases livelihoods. They are also very aware of the environmental degradation such as erosion and pollution, but people tend not to distinguish changes in the weather and the environment from the more general environmental degradation. This is because to most Africans, changes in the environment and the weather have a direct effect on their daily lives. Whether it's the timing of the rains, the heat, or the environment more generally, it is clear to Africans that things are not how they used to be. But how are they responding? With their lives and livelihoods dependent on the weather, most people are trying to respond to the changes they witness. For example, some individuals are digging channels to direct floodwaters from their homes, while others say they have erected grass barriers to protect their farmland from erosion. Despite these existing methods to cope with this changing climate, many people, particularly rural populations, feel these strategies are failing in the face of an increasingly unpredictable and intense weather. With limited resources and climatic information available, ladies and gentlemen, most people say they react after problems have manifested themselves, rather than preparing for them. For example, In the face of drought, people in rural communities described how they resorted to unclean water sources, they relied on family for support, and only in some cases diversifying their livelihoods. In some countries, people have been forced to migrate as their traditional livelihoods have become unsustainable. Many more say they will migrate if the problem they were facing became more severe and frequent. With their crops failing and their attempt to prepare and deal with the impact of the changing weather often unsuccessful, many rural people, particularly women, say that they turn to prayer. Although this wasn't prevalent in all locations, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, and Ethiopia and Nigeria, many people felt that there is little else as individuals they could do. On language, despite people recognizing that their weather is changing and that these changes are profoundly affecting their lives, most people in Africa are very removed from global climate change. This is also true for many of the opinion leaders we spoke to, particularly community leaders. In many of the countries outside main urban centers, people do not recognize terms for climate change or as global warming in either local languages or the widely spoken international languages like English, French, and Arabic. There is no easy translation for climate change in many African languages. Often people hear the words in English or in the local language and literally translate them to understand their meaning. For example, in Swahili, which is spoken here in Kenya, climate change has been translated to mabadiliko ya hali ya hewa or hali ya anga, which means changes in atmosphere or air. In some African languages, there is no word for climate. In Bari, a local Sudanese language, for example, there is no word for climate or weather. So if you're talking about the climate, you explain it by using words like clouds, rainfall, wind, temperature, and season. It is no surprise, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, that many Africans understand the words climate change to refer to the changing weather of seasons. The implication then is that when you say climate change to someone in Africa, it does not convey anything about greenhouse gases, global emissions, or long-term changes in the weather. But how do they explain these changes? In the absence of an understanding of global climate change, many people draw on their existing knowledge and believe to explain the unpredictable weather. People often blame local environmental degradation. For example, many people think that the main cause of drought and decreases in rainfall is local deforestation because they believe that trees attract rain. Like a woman from northern Tanzania says, in the quote, if the forests are cut down, there is drought, end of quote. Many people therefore see tree planting as a natural solution. It's important to emphasize that local tree planting is indeed good for the environment and can affect the microclimate, but these beliefs could be problematic as local tree planting will not necessarily solve the climatic problems that people are facing. Some see smoke from cars, cooking stoves and factories in their local areas and believe that this damages the ozone layer. In general, Africans blame themselves for the impact they are witnessing. They feel it is the trees they are cutting down or the smoke they are emitting that is causing the changes in the weather they experience. There is little awareness that the climatic problems facing Africa now and in the future are likely to have causes that extend beyond the continent. Some Africans also understand changes in weather in relation to their spiritual beliefs. They attribute the changes of weather to the will of God. A woman from Ethiopia explained, and I quote, Allah brings rain. The one who causes the drought is Allah. This happens regardless of the person's religion. These beliefs do not preclude people from accepting the idea people can impact the weather and environment, but they do mean that the control in influencing and catalyzing the responses to climate change. The possible that is just free. It is not the general public that is telling to have to do to the climate change. Knowledge among opinion leaders also varies. Local community and faith leaders have unrivaled access to the communities most impacted by climate change, yet they tend to be the least informed about it. They clearly need more information about the subject if they have helped their communities respond. Opinion leaders from the media are knowledgeable about climate change, but even they admit that reporting on climate change is a challenge and that many in the sector lack a clear understanding of climate change concepts and processes. They recognize that climate change is impacting the lives of much of their audience, but say current reporting on it is too scientific and inaccessible to those people most affected. Now, this research also highlighted a communication challenge. Leading policymakers from the government, NGOs and private sector are among the most knowledgeable about climate change and recognize the gaps in the public understanding. But many acknowledge that it is an elite topic that many do not fully understand. Some of these opinion leaders have noted similarities between the challenges of communicating HIV and AIDS and the challenges of communicating climate change. They are concerned that, as in the early days of HIV and AIDS dialogue, the most affected groups do not have access to the necessary information about the issue. They say that accessible language must be used and the issues made relevant to the people most affected. The Kenyan government, which recently released a climate change response strategy, acknowledges these facts as well. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, the research reports go into far greater details than I can be able to do in this particular forum. But let me end with a few conclusions about the communication challenges highlighted in the last cut-off of climate. One, there is need for immediate action. Many Africans, particularly those in rural areas, are struggling in the face of an increasingly unpredictable weather. They therefore need greater information and resources. Two, on language. Climate change terminology is not easy to translate or understand. It provides little insight into the reality of the changes that most Africans are experiencing. Efforts therefore needs to be invested in developing appropriate climate change terminology in local African languages so that climate change can be discussed in a locally relevant way. On leadership, opinion leaders are struggling to provide leadership on climate change. They need to know more about climate change in order to communicate confidently on the issue and incorporate mitigation and adaptation strategies into their decision making. Local community leaders are well placed to communicate climate change and help their communities respond, but they are among the most misinformed about it. On media, many in the sector affect the lack knowledge of climate change and consider it too scientific and not an audience priority. The capacity of media, both news and non-news media, needs therefore to be built in order to communicate climate change in locally relevant ways. Lastly, on information, African citizens need spaces to exchange ideas and information, foster understanding, and plan for action. To be identified at the national and local level to cut through the climate change noise and facilitate the public engagement. Let me pass you on over to Anna to talk about some of our recommendations and next steps. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for listening.